Installing Falcon shocks for the Toyota 4Runner will allow you to level out the rake in the front end and give you a 1-inch lift in the rear. Be aware that to install the front shocks, use of a spring compressor will be required. Spring compressors should only be used by trained operators. You may need to take the coilover assemblies to a garage if you do not have access to a spring compressor. Raise the vehicle and remove the wheels and tires. Detach the ABS line and brake line brackets. Disconnect the tie rod by removing the cotter pin and then the nut. If the pin on the ball joint won't release, strike the knuckle with a hammer to loosen it. Remove the nut connecting the sway bar link to the knuckle and detach the sway bar link. You will need to swing the sway bar out of the way, so detach the sway bar link on the other side of the vehicle as well. Disconnect the upper control arm ball joint from the knuckle, remove the cotter pin and loosen the nut, but do not remove it. Again, use a hammer and strike the knuckle to loosen it. Mark the tower, isolator, and the spring before removing the coilover assembly from the tower. Aligning these at reinstallation will ensure the spring is reinstalled in the correct position. Remove the 3 upper nuts on the coilover assembly. Remove the lower nut and bolt, then remove the coilover assembly from the vehicle. Before installing the front Falcon shocks, you will need to determine the desired ride height. The shocks have 3 options: medium, level, and heavy accessory. The shocks are preset to level. This setting will eliminate the need for leveling spacers. The heavy accessory setting is designed for those with heavy bumpers, winches, or other accessories. This setting will maintain a level ride height even with increased weight. Medium puts the ride height as close to the stock ride height as possible. Because of the Falcon shock's heavy-duty design, it is not possible to set the Falcon shocks to the stock ride height. Place the front bump stops onto the shaft with the wide end towards the top. After the ride height has been determined, have a qualified mechanic separate the spring from the original shock and install the spring onto the Falcon shock body. Be sure the grease zerk aligns with the center of the gap between the 2 outer studs. Apply anti-seize and run the shaft nut on, then remove the shock from the compressor. Torque the nut to 40 foot-pounds. We found the best way to torque this nut is to use a 19mm crowfoot wrench on the nut and keep the shaft from spinning using an 8mm wrench. With the grease zerk facing the wheel, install the upper studs into the strut tower. Set the lower eyelet into place and use the factory hardware. Torque to 61 foot-pounds. Return to the top and torque these nuts to 47 foot-pounds. Reattach the upper control arm to the knuckle by pushing down with a pry bar. Feed the nut onto the ball joint and torque to 81 foot-pounds. You may need to tighten a little more to install the cotter pin. Always tighten the nut, never back it off. Reconnect the sway bar link to the knuckle and torque to 52 foot-pounds. Reconnect the tie rod, torque to 57 foot-pounds. Again, you may have to tighten a little more to install the cotter pin. Support the rear axle and remove the factory shocks. To loosen the upper nut, hold the stud in place with pliers to keep it from spinning. There's not very much room, so you will have to use an open-end wrench. Remove the bolt from the bottom of the shock. Compress the shock and remove the upper stud from the upper shock mount. Slide the bottom eyelet off the stud on the lower mount. Retain the bushings and hardware. Detach the upper end of the rear sway bar links on both sides. Remove the bolt on the axle end of the rear track bar. There is also a clip that will need to be removed. Raise the vehicle or lower the axle. Remove the rear springs. Install the included inch-tall spacer between the spring and the spring isolator. Replace the rear springs. Make sure the lower end of the spring aligns with the index on the spring mount. Attach the roost guards to the rear Falcon shocks. Use blue thread lock on the bolt and tighten it to 30 inch-pounds. Install the Falcon shock's lower eyelet onto the mount post, then finger tighten the factory bolt. Place one of the factory bushings onto the upper shock stud. Compress the shock enough to clear the upper spring mount, and then insert the upper stud into the vehicle's upper shock mount. Place the other bushing on top and use the provided nut. Install the reservoir anchor assembly by sliding the rubber end in between the Falcon shock's body and reservoir. The vehicle's frame has two threaded holes to which you will attach the reservoir anchor assembly bracket using the provided hardware. Tighten the nut on the top of the shock and the bolt on the lower eyelet. Tighten the hardware connecting the metal bracket to the rubber anchor. Place the sway bar link spacer onto the sway bar link under the rubber bushing. Replace the bushing and set the link into the sway bar link mount. To install the upper bushing and nut, it may be necessary to push up on the sway bar with a pry bar. We found that on newer vehicles, the bushings were a little less compressed and it was a little bit harder to get the nut to feed onto the threads. Remove the bolt connecting the driver's side brake line bracket to the frame. Install the provided extension using the factory bolt on the frame end and the provided hardware on the bracket end. Install the extension on the passenger side as well. Once installed, pull down and bend the bracket just a little to keep the lines away from the exhaust. Remove the factory bump stops. Install the Falcon bump stop mount using the factory hardware. Use a silicone-based lubricant on the bump stop and install by pushing up while twisting. Remove the bolt connecting the brake line anchor bracket to the lower control arm bracket. Set the bump stop pad into place and install the provided bolt into the brake line anchor bracket and the bump stop pad. Replace the wheels and tires and reinstall the axle end of the rear track bar once the vehicle is back on the ground.